director de Studio Miessen. Ha recibido muchos premios, incluyendo el Flemish Government, Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Art y el Henry Saxon Snell Prize. En 2008, The Independent nombró su libro, Alguien dijo, participar, como uno de los 10 mejores libros de arquitectura de todos los tiempos. Recibamos a Markus Miessen.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We're running a little bit late, apparently, so I'm trying to stick to the time that was given to me, which is also going to be part of a little experiment today, because I'm not going to be talking about my practice in general, but I've decided to basically concentrate on two things. One is a kind of general introduction to some of the theoretical work that I've been involved in the last 10 years, or over the last 10 years. And then one specific part of my practice, which has been, and that I've been dealing with over the last 3 to 4 years, which is a kind of umbrella project which unites several projects of the studio, which is called Cultures of Assembly. So the way that I've been working over the last 10 years has mostly been driven by, let's say, a kind of ongoing research project that's been going on in parallel to the studio projects, but has been very interlinked with a lot of the design projects. And it was a project on, you could say, alternative modes of participation, or more generally speaking, a kind of understanding of what participation really means today. And I've been doing that through a series of 4 books. Did Someone Say Participate? The Violence of Participation, The Nightmare of Participation, and a kind of conclusive piece which is called Waking Up from the Nightmare of Participation. Unfortunately, there won't be really enough time to go into all of the books now in detail, but I'll try to give a bit of a kind of background information in terms of what the research was really about. So, as you've just seen in the last slide, the project really started with a kind of research endeavor which was called Did Someone Say Participate? An Atlas of Spatial Practice, which was part of my MA and PhD research. And it started as a kind of very naive form of looking at what's going on in terms of different participatory approaches today, in terms of politics, in terms of culture in general, but specifically in terms of contemporary spatial practices. So when I'm talking about spatial practice today, what I'm really trying to talk about is not architecture or urbanism per se, but more generally speaking, all the different practices, disciplines, and let's say activities that together make up the production of space, or that together make up the kind of cities in which we live. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from, excuse me, from the book, some projects that we showcased as examples of the kind of practices that we were interested in. This is a project by a human rights activist called Rebecca Gompertz. It's a project called Women on Waves, and the image that you see here is an image that was taken off the coast of Australia, and it's basically a floating abortion clinic that is being tried to, being stopped by Australian Navy vessels. However, what's very important to say is that there was actually never an abortion carried out on the vessel. It was more to generate a kind of public debate, especially in those countries where abortion is illegal, regarding different practices and, let's say, legal frameworks regarding abortion. This is an image from a UN project in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish region. And these people that are doing this, you have to imagine it's like 700 people who are all doing the same thing, which is basically to slowly walk through a field of mines and to basically demine it. The reason why we were very interested in this is that, in a way, it's the exact opposite of architecture, which usually tends to be about adding elements to the environments that we inhabit. And basically what these guys are doing is they're removing something, and by removing something, they're creating a kind of future potential for, in this case, future inhabitation. This is a project by actually Mexican artist called Mauricio Gillen, who's living in London, and who did a project about this kind of fantastic, a photographic kind of project about these fantastic kind of small-scale security booths that are kind of securing the architecture that you see behind it, but in the way in which they're doing it kind of weirdly mimicking the architectural language of the object that they're actually supposed to secure. This is a photographic study of an artist from Italy called Armin Linke, who looked at the kind of spatial and geographical changes of the Davos World Economic Summit, and how during the period of the summit this small Swiss alpine village basically gets turned into a kind of militarized fortress. So one thing that really started the research work for the Nightmare of Participation was, for me, a kind of question of, when we're looking at participatory projects today, whether it's really something that, you know, we're convinced about in terms of actual politics, or whether it's maybe something that is being used as a kind of term or terminology that, at least since the mid-90s, has become very en vogue. Or if it's something else. I mean, maybe we're just constantly talking about participation, but what we're actually meaning to say is something else. So one of the things that really scared me, especially in the kind of early research work of the project, was the way that, especially in the kind of late 90s and early 00s under Tony Blair and New Labour, there was a certain kind of misuse of the term, I found. And specifically in the kind of political arena, the word participation was quite often used as a tool for political legitimization, i.e. saying that if I'm actually going to ask all of you in the room here today to, you know, kind of participate in certain activities that are happening on the stage, regardless of whether I'm really interested in your participation, I'm always in a very kind of luxurious position after the talk, because I can say that I've involved you, and if you weren't up for this kind of involvement, that's your problem and not mine. So it's a kind of very interesting, let's say, energy or kind of dynamic that evolved in the late 90s and early 00s. And what I tried to develop, and I'm obviously making this super short now because there's not so much time, was to develop a kind of model of participation which is almost a kind of complete inversion of the term. So where basically participation is no longer about the idea of surrounding everyone around a table so that all of you, for example, would make decisions together with me, but rather where I'm, as a kind of uninvited outsider, coming into a territory which is either unknown to me or where I haven't been invited, to kind of introduce, let's say, change from the outside. So it's much more about the I than the we, but not in a kind of sense of the person, but rather about the kind of individual involvement. So the question is really, how do you act today without mandate? I mean, especially, for example, in the context of this conference, I guess like a lot of projects that we've seen, they're kind of like commissioned architectural projects. But of course, there's also kind of practice beyond that field of commissioned architecture. And the question is, what is this and what can this be? And also, of course, what does this mean in terms of a kind of general consensus, or the question of consensus in practice, and how can we maybe understand also forms of dissensus as productive modes of conflict and practice? Excuse me. So for me, there's really kind of three very important or kind of central questions that drove the work. One is the question of responsibility and how we assume that. The question of authorship and what this means in terms of a kind of collaborative practice or collaborative approach. And the question of agency and, from my point of view, the very kind of serious danger of trying to understand the architect as a kind of good doer. In other words, you know, just because the architect is doing something in the city, does that mean that, you know, by default it becomes a kind of like social animal, or is it something else that we've actually forgot to look at? And there's a kind of, unfortunately, German word which actually describes very well what I'm interested in, but you can't really translate it in one term. So it sits somewhere between these three terms. So the German word is Einmischung, and it sits between proactive practice, getting involved, and practicing as a productive irritant. So here you see 6 images. They all, in one way or another, have something to do with different forms of, you could say, participation or participatory approaches, whether it's in, through artistic practice, whether it's through kind of general kind of public events, or architectural kind of research projects. But one image that I'm particularly interested in here is the one on the top left, which is an image from the House of Lords in the UK, which I'm sure, as most of you are aware, is a kind of incredibly conservative political setting. Because the only reason why you can be in this kind of political space is either because of the history of your family or because the Queen thinks that you should be in there. But regardless of this context, what I'm very interested in is a particular group of people in this room, which is these guys here in the middle, and they're called the crossbenchers. So not only are they called the crossbenchers, but they're also sitting on these kind of physical elements that are perpendicular to the rest of the space, and they're called the crossbenches. To me, they're very interesting for 2 reasons. One is that as kind of individuals, they're not representing any party. So the ones that you see on the left and the ones that you see on the right, this is Labour and Conservative. And the ones that you see in the middle, they're kind of like free-floating animals, you could say. They're kind of the only kind of people or party that they actually represent is themselves. So I'm only using this as an analogy. I'm very aware that this is a very kind of conflicted and difficult kind of political space. I'm very interested in the way in which they can actually bring in like external expertise. Which you can also see here in terms of the general kind of setting. This is where these guys are located. So what I've been trying to work around in some of the projects that are concerned with this kind of umbrella research term, cultures of assembly, it's projects that kind of deal with the question of how one can, on a much smaller scale than most of the projects that you've seen today and probably also yesterday, how one can implement zones of conflict or zones of friction through the placing of physical elements or through the placing and design of different types of policy and protocols. So here you see another example from this, in this case, the House of Commons. And this, I think, for me, it's a really fantastic example how through the design of a very, very simple object, which is essentially a table, one can completely invert or change the way in which people, especially in a kind of formal political setting, talk to each other. So if you imagine like most of the kind of parliamentary settings across the globe, I'm over-exaggerating, but they're more or less a kind of like setting like this. So there's someone in the front speaking to you, and you're all looking at me or at a kind of speaker. And there's very little kind of like engagement between the 2 different parties, between the speaker and the audience. Here we have a very interesting situation, which is that everything is designed around the idea or the concept of proximity. So the actual 2 political opponents are only separated 2 meters from each other, and they're actually facing each other. So if one disagrees, the one that disagrees gets up and faces the kind of political opponent directly. And of course, there's also much more interesting things to this image, which unfortunately I don't have now the time to go into. But it's something that very much kind of interests me in terms of the kind of scale and proximity of how things can be, let's say, designed and developed in regard to the question of assembly and what that means in terms of a spatial grammar. So we've been dealing with a lot of research projects in this regard. There were different projects that were running from the Städelschule in Frankfurt, where I had a professorship for a couple of years and where we really started it as a kind of research endeavor. And as I already mentioned, we looked very much and very deeply into these kind of different kind of political settings, both formally like this one, but also very informally, like in this case, the Occupy camp in Frankfurt, which unfortunately now I also don't have the time to go into in detail, but it was specifically interesting because it was in a context where it was the only one of the Occupy camps that was actually located directly outside one of the major banks, in this case the European Central Bank. And there were a lot of very interesting aspects to it in terms of how the camp was deliberately designed in order to overcome certain restrictions by the city. One of them was through a kind of inversion of a policy which has to do with the way in which you're allowed to demonstrate in the city of Frankfurt. There's also a book that's dealing with this particular project, what's Critical Spatial Practice, which is part of a book series that we're editing at Sternberg Press together with Nikolaus Hirsch. So in the context of cultures of assembly, for me, the two kind of, like, say, driving forces are how to stage discourse and how to enable conflict. I'm going to run you through a couple of design projects that we've been involved in over the last couple of years that were looking at this specifically. One was a project in Murcia in Spain during the Manifesta Biennial. It was a project which tried to deal with different forms of a kind of like reassignment of some of the, let's say, design practices that I just introduced to you in terms of the House of Commons. It was a stage set that was designed for a kind of documentary film that was produced by a Turkish filmmaker prior to the biennial, and where then later on the props that were produced for the set were also used as a kind of like central gathering space at the biennial, and at the same time a kind of display space for the documentary by the Turkish filmmaker. We've been running through a series of projects that have been dealing with what we at the studio call a kind of sauna typology, i.e. sauna like a hot room. So this is a space in Berlin called Archive Cabinet, which is a kind of very strange, let's say, institutional bastard typology that sits somewhere between a publishing house, a gallery, a discursive space, and a bookshop and archive. And they have one kind of central space that they're using to come together and have kind of discursive events. And what was very particular about this space was that we decided to design a space where there's basically no stage, but where whatever happens has to happen like within the kind of confined space of the audience. And where also everything was designed to kind of slightly wrong measurements. So basically this space, it's incredibly small, and it creates a very kind of serious form of, I would say, physical discomfort. So when you're actually sitting there as a member of the audience, like everything somehow feels wrong. So it's kind of too hot, you're too close to your neighbor, you can't really escape, because in order to escape you would have to get up, you would have to walk down, like everyone's looking at you like nobody does it. And basically within 20 minutes and like 50 people in the room, the temperature is like above 35 centigrade. But it's very interesting because it generates a completely different way of talking to each other, which has a lot to do with not only proximity, but also this kind of physical friction between people, and the fact that this kind of relationship between audience and speaker has been completely dissolved. There's a project in Seoul with Art Sonje, where we tried something similar, but which had much more to do with a kind of relationship between the inside and the outside of the institution. So in this case, we built this kind of tiny kind of concrete pavilion, which houses a kind of very small format of the sauna, which is this one. And as you can see in the background, there is a staircase here that takes you down into a kind of cinema space, which is actually quite similar to this space that we're in right now. It's just a bit smaller. And usually when there's conferences or any kind of discursive events at Art Sonje, at the institution, it always takes place in the cinema. But from our point of view, it was a very kind of problematic form to stage kind of discursive events, because there wasn't really a kind of exchange between audience and speakers. So what we decided was that there's actually I mean, if it has already arrived at that point, what we're going to do is we're going to completely displace the speakers. So inside the actual space, there's only going to be audience, and the speakers are all going to be up in the sauna. And the sauna is also a kind of like live web space where everything is constantly streamed online, where people can actually interfere with what's being said on stage. So in a way, it's being kind of removed from the local context into a kind of, I mean, weirdly global context where there's some form of possibility to interact with what's happening in terms of the discussion on stage, so to speak. We've also been working on a series of spaces that, as a kind of typology, we call it the hub or hubs, mainly with different biennales around the world. We've been working for 3 editions with Performer Biennial in New York, and recently also with Gwangju Biennale in Korea. This was the first space that we designed for them, which is already a couple of years ago in 2009. And this was really the idea to create a space which, again, it's a kind of like a bastard typology in the sense that it tries to combine a lot of different programs, but without the programs necessarily being visible all the time. But they're actually running in parallel, so they create like conflicts between each other. So for example, in this case, it was the central kind of meeting space for the biennial, which in the case of Performer, it's a decentralized or decentrally organized biennial over 120 spaces in New York. And so they had this kind of necessity of a kind of central meeting space, which would also combine, you know, a bookshop, a radio station, different forms of screening spaces. But because basically there was a kind of possibility to extend the space by opening up different elements of the wall, it created a situation where all of a sudden there were lots of things happening in parallel that created a certain space of conflict. And this, for example, is the Performer Hub from 2013. And what you see here is that basically we followed a kind of similar logic, but with everything literally organized as a completely open space. So in a way, it's a very similar approach to the edition in 2009, but more like a kind of X-ray where everything is visible all the time and where there's a kind of like complete chaos that's being generated because there's, you know, at any one time there's at least 5 or 6 different kind of programs happening in parallel. This is one of the spaces that we designed for the Gwangju Biennial, which also plays with this idea of kind of similar to the sauna at Archive Cabinet, the question of how, for example, wrong or slightly kind of discomfortable proportions can create zones of friction between audience and speaker or speakers. As part of this Cultures of Assembly project, we've also been involved in a series of institution building projects where we basically help or assist larger art or contemporary art institutions to, I mean, in a kind of like using a kind of nasty business language, you would say kind of rebrand themselves. But we tend to speak of a kind of like spatial CI. So the question of how one can actually, let's say, adopt a certain identity that usually is being generated by graphic designers when a new director is coming to an institution, and how this can be kind of transferred into space. So in this case, it was a project with Witte de Wit in Rotterdam, which is one of the important art institutions in the city, where as part of this project, we, for example, proposed that it was a very small change, but a very important one, which was that this section of the, which used to be wall, would be cut open with like kind of diamond cutters. So you take out a bit of the facade in order to actually create a kind of dialogue between the city, you could say, or in this case, the pavement and the pedestrians, and the actual inside of the institution, which before was kind of super hermetic. We also developed for them different, let's say, sets or props that they could use for different kind of discursive events, like this one, which started as a kind of monolith that just sits as a kind of monolithic block in the middle of the room, then can be rearranged as they see fit, and it consists of 64 L-shaped units. We've also designed a space for them which is called the consensus bar, which actually was my favorite part of this project, which was a kind of like ridiculous brief, because they told us that they had this leftover space on the first floor, which they asked us if it would be possible to turn this somehow into an exhibition space, which we thought was very strange because it's not really fitting in any way. But what was interesting was that this very small space was actually sandwiched between two administrative departments, one of Witte de Wit and the other one of TENT, which is the other institution with which Witte de Wit is sharing the building. So these two institutions are in a kind of constant conflict situation. And so what we proposed to them instead was to turn this kind of central space into a bar, which would only be open every Friday from 5 to 6 p.m., where basically all of the staff members from Witte de Wit and TENT would have to meet for an hour and drink vodka together. So basically this kind of element in the back consists of 3 fridges, which are constantly stocked with vodka bottles. We've also been involved in some other projects that are dealing with this question of spatial CI, like this one, for example, at the Institute of Modern Art in Brisbane in Australia, which in this case was actually about like rethinking what a kind of, let's say, reception area or a kind of foyer area of a kind of contemporary art institution really means today, where, I mean, hopefully, at least from our point of view, it's no longer about a kind of hermetic or concealed understanding of an institution vis-a-vis the audience or vis-a-vis the kind of pedestrians, but a space in which different forms of kind of discursive elements can be introduced. Like in this case, not only a book archive and a kind of space in which people can actually work, but also the idea that a lot of the kind of discursive events that the Institute of Modern Art is organizing are actually happening in the very same space where this kind of like archival practices are being played out every day. And this was connected also to an exhibition that we designed for Hito Steyer, who's a Berlin-based artist with whom we've been working quite a lot over the last couple of years. And her work, which, I mean, to those of you who don't know her, it's mostly video-based. And it's very interesting because it's constantly raising the question of how, as a kind of member of the audience, as a visitor to the show or to one of the exhibitions or to the pavilion at the Biennale, how one actually deals with the question of confrontation of usually quite large-scale screened moving images and the question of time. I mean, for example, if you're moving through an exhibition with kind of still images, you could say, then you usually tend to make decisions quite quickly as to where you're going to stay and where you're going to stop. But in a situation like this, quite often her films, you know, have a duration which exceeds kind of 10 minutes. So the question was how to deal with this and how also to think about kind of spatial framework that would be appropriate for these pieces. And I'm only going to show 2 images here, one from a kind of recent show at Artist Space in New York, where we've basically developed further a kind of typology that we designed for her about 2 years ago, which is essentially like a quarter pipe, like you use in skateboarding, but as a kind of backdrop to actually create a scenario where people can actually stay for a longer period and kind of feel comfortable actually watching the works. And excuse me, this is an image from her first retrospective that happened at Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, which we also designed, and which was really dealing with the question of how basically you can think of a different approach to an exhibition where basically every piece of art that's being shown, which in her case it's always kind of moving image, can have a very specific spatial response to the way that the works are being shown. I'm going to talk about one project that is connected to the question of cultures of assembly, but it's the only project, let's say, that's happening on a very different scale, which you could say it's almost happening on an urban scale, but it's actually happening in a context which is the exact opposite of the urban, and it's the kind of like brutal, kind of rural, somewhere between Frankfurt and Cologne in Germany, really in the middle of nowhere. It's in a kind of area where there's mostly very dense forest, which was one of the reasons why the US military during the Cold War decided that this was going to be a place where they're going to store nuclear warheads during the Cold War. And this kind of old map that you can see here shows basically two different sectors of this military base. The American sector, which was this one, which was where the nuclear warheads would be stored, and then the so-called German sector, which is this one, which was basically storing the actual missiles that would carry the nuclear warheads. But for kind of obvious post-war reasons, there had to be a kind of split between the two. And the idea was, yes, I'm almost done. So in case of a kind of like nuclear fallout with the Soviet Union, they would have both driven down to the kind of access point and would have assembled the rocket. And as you can see here, it's a kind of very strange site because they deliberately chose a place in the middle of nowhere, but then because they cut all the trees, they made it kind of like brutally visible from the air. So nobody really understands why they did it this way. What happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall was that the Americans left the site and left it basically in disrepair. And about 6 years ago, there was an initiative by a local architect who basically bought the site for €1 of the government, because in Germany that happens quite often, that the government doesn't want to take care of these kind of sites any longer. And this person is currently turning this into an art institution. And we're basically doing the kind of framework design for this center. As you can see here, there have already been some kind of tests going on. The institution currently consists of a series of 16 bunkers, which will be over time extended into a kind of series of other new kind of buildings, and also different kind of program frameworks that will happen in 3 phases, of which each phase is 5 years long. So basically in 15 years from now, the institution, so to speak, will be finished. And that's it, and I hope I didn't overrun my time too much. Thank you very much.